What's up, guys? I kind of wanted to just take a little bit of time and talk more about Sony and the PS5. Not necessarily to harp on the whole disc thing, but I kind of want to just reflect, I guess, here 6 years into the PS5 console generation, what we really have here. And I think that amongst situations like Concord, which happen, there's flops in every generation, every console's got games they're not so proud of, but the decision to purchase Bungie for the sake of teaching other developers how to make live service games and not, you know, taking advantage of what Bungie is capable of, but being like, hey, we want something like Marathon, we want more live service because something like Helldivers 2 was successful. Yeah, let's pivot in that direction and make sure that that's like all we're doing. Let's close down Blue Point, things like that. That and the PC launch of Helldivers 2, not great. The PC port of The Last of Us Part 1, also not great. These are things that Sony is still responsible for. It does still fall under the PS5 generation. Also, their decision to cut ties with Steam, not the best one in my opinion. And you look at the games that we have here, like, what are the big PS5 games? Spider-Man 2, which, while a great game, is still kind of just an expansion of what we had on Spider-Man PS4. God of War Ragnarok, same deal. Great game, phenomenal game, but not something that you couldn't have done on PS4, as evidenced by the fact that the game does run on PS4. Sure, it's stunted, but still. Horizon Forbidden West, just an upgrade to what you had on the PS4 version. Gran Turismo 7, same deal. Like, what do we have on PS5 that really feels new, like it was crafted from the ground up to take advantage of this hardware and what it can do? Astrobot, I haven't played it yet, but I hear it's a great game, and it's good that Sony has a mascot nailed down again. For a while I was concerned that Sony wasn't interested in childlike games or cartoony games or games with heavily stylized art direction, because they weren't doing Jack or Slendy anymore, or even for a while they weren't doing Ratchet. And I'm glad that Ratchet's back, and I'm glad they have Astrobot now, because as much as I like God of War and The Last of Us, the dark, gritty, heavily M-rated stuff can coexist with the games that got people interested in, like the PS1 and the PS2, at least for kids. I don't understand why we can't still make games with kids in mind. Anyway, but that's not necessarily like the big killer app for PS5. Like, yes, it won Game of the Year in 2024, but it still has not really been the dominating title for the console. We've had games like Returnal and Sorrows that are new IP, and Housemarque is doing great work, but it's still like there's nothing that's been like, this is the PS5 game. Because everything that we have that could be is probably just a sequel. Like, yes, Uncharted 4 is my favorite PS4 game, with the exception of, like, I don't know, maybe Ghost of Tsushima. But like Ghost of Tsushima and Ghost of Yotei, as much as I love Ghost of Yotei, it's just an upgrade of what we got on PS4. Like, I don't know, the PS4 gave us like Bloodborne, and it gave us Spider-Man and The Last Guardian and Horizon Zero Dawn and Neo and Days Gone and things like that. Like, these new IP that do help to inform the identity of the console. I mean, Bloodborne to this day is one of the highest rated games on that platform, and it came out 11 years ago. The PS5 just doesn't have anything that helps to define it. And the reason for this is twofold. One, when the console launched, it was during a major component shortage. There was a huge microchip shortage. Everybody probably recalls this. It was affecting PC parts, it was affecting the Xbox Series consoles as well. For the first 2, maybe even 3 years of the console's life, it was incredibly difficult to get your hands on one. I got lucky when I got my PS5 just under 1 year in. But, a lot of people didn't necessarily have that opportunity. And Sony acknowledged this. They recognized this, and they're like, okay, to show our commitment to our player base, we will release most PS5 games on PS4 as well, so that people can still play them even if they have not gotten a chance to get their hands on the new hardware. I thought this was a great idea. A lot of people disagreed, and I can see why. There were people that were concerned that working on a last gen SKU for a game would hinder the current gen version. It would take resources away, it would take time and effort away from making the game run as best as it possibly can on PS5 when you're working on a PS4 version. And I get where you're coming from on that. I just feel like they did this with the best of intentions. They wanted people to still be able to play the game even if they could not get their hands on a PS5. I don't necessarily see a problem with that in theory. For me, though, I found it confusing that the $10 price increase that we saw in this generation of games was also present on the PS4 version of games. If you couldn't get your hands on a PS5 and so you had to get the PS4 version of Horizon Forbidden West or Gran Turismo 7 or God of War Ragnarok, you should have only had to pay $60. I think charging $70 for those titles, even on PS4, is absolutely ridiculous. It's one of the things that I think kind of blurs the line between last gen and this one in the eyes of a lot of people. And I'm not the only person that feels that way. There's been a lot of discussion about this online for the last, half decade. There's so many things working against Sony when it comes to, establishing this console as a true replacement, or something that can stand alongside the PS4 in gaming history, something that belongs on the Mount Rushmore of consoles. Because in my mind, just about everything about using the PS5 is a step down from the PS4 as far as user experience is concerned. And one of the other problems I think that's caused this generation to feel expendable compared to previous generations, especially off of the heels of how strong the PS4 really was, is game development cycles take so long now. So incredibly long now. And this is something that did impact the PS4, Xbox One generation as well. But you look at like the PS3 or the 360, there were 4 Gears of War's games on the 360, and there were what, 3? How many Killzone games? How many Resistance games were there on the PS3? These games would start on one console and then have a whole trilogy on said console. Who's calling me? Nowadays, and yes, this does start with the PS4, games take so long to make that if a franchise starts on the PS5, the likelihood that you see the next game on PS5 is slim to none. I think that the first major PS6 game that we were shown was Intergalactic by Naughty Dog. This game was revealed at the Game Awards in 2024? It's been almost 2 years since then. I still don't think that that's going to be a game on PS5. Okay, let's address the elephant in the room. Physical games are going away in 2028. I think that Intergalactic, even though it was shown in 2024, is going to be the first major scale PlayStation exclusive game to really usher in that all digital age. I think that's a PS6 game. That's how ridiculous things are. And even if, back on the PS4, one franchise in particular did not get multiple installments on the same console, at least that developer was doing a lot. Insomniac has been carrying the last 2 generations on their backs because they put out 3 games per console generation, right? PS4. If we're being honest, they put out 4 games that generation because they did Sunset Overdrive in 2015 for the Xbox One. 1 year later, they dropped Ratchet and Clank for the PS4. That was them, right? Let me actually verify that. Yes, that was also Insomniac, and that was made to tie into the movie that came out that same year. 2 years after that, they dropped Spider-Man 2018, and then 2 years after that, they dropped Spider-Man Miles Morales, and then 1 year after that, for the PS5, they dropped Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. 2 years after that, they dropped Spider-Man 2, and they were trying to drop a Venom game, and they might have had it not been for that massive ransomware attack. 3 years after Spider-Man 2, they dropped Wolverine. You look at Sony Santa Monica, 2018, they dropped God of War. 4 years go by, they drop Ragnarok. Impressive turnaround time, I'll admit. 4 years later, though, they announce a new God of War game, which is a spin-off, not a mainline franchise entry. So it still doesn't exactly scratch that same itch. We're still waiting maybe 6, maybe 7 years for another game about Kratos. You know, you look at Sucker Punch, they have stopped doing Infamous, they have stopped doing Sly Cooper, they only do Ghost now, it looks like. They dropped Ghost of Tsushima in 2020. They then miss most of the PS5 generation, and they dropped Ghost of Yotei in 2025. The next Ghost game is coming out on the PS6. We're doing this in such a way that you're getting one game in a franchise that you like per console generation. I don't really understand how anyone can find that acceptable. The fact that, like, Square Enix is putting out these remakes of Final Fantasy VII faster, 7 years you get the whole trilogy. I don't think that that's too bad. You look at Capcom, there's been 3 brand new Resident Evil games over the last 9 years. And at that exact same time, they dropped a remake for 2 and 3 and 4. There's damn near a Resident Evil game coming out every year or every other year. That's mind-blowing, and yes, Resident Evil 3 suffered the most out of all of those games, but you still got 5 solid games out of those 6. And not to mention the fact that Capcom, in that same time span, has also dropped Devil May Cry, Monster Hunter Wilds, Pragmata. You know, there's a new Onimusha coming out this year. The next Resident Evil remake comes out next year. You look at From Software, they put out, you know, Dark Souls 3, Sekiro, and Elden Ring all on the PS4. It's possible. You can make huge games with so much going on, and you can do it in such a way that it doesn't take 8 years to drop. Rockstar, this is absolutely abysmal. 5 years between GTA 5 and Red Dead 2, and then 8 years between Red Dead 2 and GTA 6. I'm sorry, I just don't think that 13 years between game sequels is an acceptable business model no matter who the developer is. There's no reason for that. And if you think that anything Sony is doing is going to offset this, then you're absolutely mistaken. You know, it's only going to get more expensive. It's only going to take longer. It's only going to get worse as time goes on. And I think that the PS5 is really the first sign that I'm not going to sit here and doom and be like, the end is upon us, you know, gaming is over, there's no fun left to be had. That's not my intention here. My intention is really to hold Sony's feet to the fire, at least as best I can for the size of what I got going on here. But I legitimately think that something has to be done. People talk about the AAA gaming bubble bursting, gaming headed towards another crash. I think that that's entirely possible, especially with the big 3 in console manufacturing making bad decision after bad decision. Yes, it's entirely possible that we do have another crash or another industry collapse, and maybe indie takes a hold of things after a while. We'll kind of just have to see what that looks like. Maybe it's time for something to force an evolution, or to force true innovation. And at the time, that was Sony. Not so much anymore, though. But, I mean, I guess that's all I really have to say about the PS5 today. If you agree with anything, if you disagree with anything, please let me know in the comments. I want to have a healthy discussion about this hobby that we all share. While you're down there, why don't you go ahead and tell me what your favorite PS5 game has been so far? Me, I'm simple. If we're talking, you know, strictly first party, I'm gonna go with God of War Ragnarok. If we're opening it up to everything, obviously Elden Ring. I haven't played anything since Elden Ring that has made me as happy as that game did. That's all I got for you guys today. I'll see you later.